This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Our next speaker is Kimberley Doyle. Kimberley is a PhD candidate in the School of History at the Australian National University. Her research is supported by a grant from the Australian Army History Unit, is an exploration of the experiences of Australian peacekeepers who served in the Pacific region. It contends that understanding Australian peacekeeping history necessarily involves going beyond policy and operational considerations to explore the everyday realities of those doing the peacekeeping. The forthcoming chapter, No Can Stop 'em Peace, if that's how you say it, Australian peacekeepers, interaction with Bougainvilleans and Solomon Islands, will be in the official history of post-Cold War peacekeeping and humanitarian operations. Kimberley completed her honours thesis on peacekeeping in Africa and Asia at Macquarie University and has previously worked in public history at the New South Wales Historic Houses Trust's Hyde Park Barracks Museum in Sydney. She's taught in the fields of British imperial history and currently employed teaching in the area of history of sexuality in Australia. So, her titles From the Trenches to Afghanistan, Australian Peacekeepers Remembering a Place for Themselves.
Thank you. Apologies for that long bio. I feel sort of feel very opposite coming after Ben because I couldn't be less of a participant interviewer if I tried. But nonetheless, I think there are some really interesting parallels between Ben's paper and mine, so hopefully there'll be some good questions at the end. Australians have been serving as peacekeepers all around the world for almost more than half a century now. And yet, interestingly, their stories remain largely unexamined by historians. Examining what peacekeeping has meant to peacekeepers and putting their voices into our histories is essential to telling a more complete story of this process. Much of the historical work that has been done has been aimed at providing depth and detail on policy, doctrinal and logistical elements of peacekeeping. Peter Lundy's important 2004 work, Other People's Wars, provides a comprehensive narrative of Australia's participation in peacekeeping since the middle of the 20th century. The 6-volume Official History of Post-Cold War Peacekeeping and Humanitarian Operations also looks set to make an important contribution as those volumes slowly get released. And certainly it's fair to say that scholars from other fields have been interested in this topic, and they've explored a wide range of issues such as race, gender, the role of the law and regulation, as well as ideas of security and imperialism, and they've done this in a variety of international contexts. So it is fair to say that a lot of this work does give us snippets and certainly does include peacekeepers' stories, but being concerned as they are with other core questions and other core issues, peacekeepers' experiences and stories don't form the central focus of their work. This project then somewhat ambitiously aims to take up this challenge. And I have done this by conducting oral history interviews with Australians who served in Bougainville, Solomon Islands and East Timor between roughly 1997 and 2007. And the interviews have really been focused on exploring their personal experience of service. In today's paper, I'm going to just specifically explore the ways in which many of the participants have negotiated a place in the contested terrain of the memories and myths of the 2 world wars and more recent and current wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan. It's interesting that the peacekeepers served in 3 different operations in 3 different countries, yet they share a similar kind of remembering and a similar way of ordering their stories. And I think that this suggests that it has not just been the places in which they have served that have shaped their memories, but it's also been the tensions and ambiguities of what it meant, and indeed, I think, fair to say, what it continues to mean to be a peacekeeper and a member of the military. The oral histories upon which this paper today is based involved about 45 interviews with Australian Defence Force personnel. This group itself comes from a wider oral history project that for my PhD dissertation, and that includes Commonwealth public servants as well as Australian Federal Police, but I won't be talking about them today, mostly because those interviews are still going. So these ADF interviews occurred between April 2012 and April of this year, and they were conducted all over the country, mostly on military bases, and for that reason it's fair to say that most of the participants came from the eastern states and the two territories, given these are home to large military communities. The interviews had an average length of around 3 hours, and they weren't life history interviews. They were much more narrowly focused on peacekeepers' years of service. There was sort of, as all of you would know, there was some kind of meandering around other issues as well, but that was the core focus of these interviews. I also just want to note at this point that I refer to peacekeepers differently in this paper, and that's because some have requested that their names and rank and other identifying information be kept anonymous. Before discussing specifically the process of memory making that I wanted to talk about today, I'm going to very, very briefly outline the operations in Bougainville, Timor and Solomons, just to give you a little bit of context for their storytelling. So the mission in East Timor began on 20th September 1999. It involved over 10,000 troops. Half of these were Australian. The mission's main job was essentially to restore security after the independence ballot, and they had the grisly task of cleaning up the massacred and tortured remains of countless Timorese. After 5 months, these jobs had essentially been done, and Australia handed over command of the mission to the United Nations, and the mission became the United Nations Transitional Authority in East Timor, or UNTAET. And UNTAET functioned essentially as the de facto government of East Timor until independence in 2002. Until earlier this year, there had been a continual peacekeeping presence in what we now know as Timor-Leste. Similarly, the Regional Assistance Mission to Solomon Islands, or RAMSI, as many of you would know it, deployed there in July 2003. 2,200 troops from all over the Pacific region were sent. About 1,400 of these came from the Australian Defence Force, and about an extra 300 came from the Federal Police and Commonwealth Public Service. Unlike the mission in Timor, RAMSI was essentially a law and order mission, so much of the work really involved doing community policing and community security work, as well as training local counterparts. A key pillar of the mission was also restoring the Solomon Islands civil service. So public servants from Australia really worked to both work in online positions in the civil service and train Solomon Islanders. In comparison to these two missions, the one in Bougainville was very small. It only had 300 personnel at its peak. It began in 1997 and ended in 2003, and the operation was made up of peacekeepers from Pacific nations. They were a mix of civilian and Defence Force personnel as well as police. And their job was to monitor the various peace agreements that had been agreed to in this period, and they did this by living in villages amongst the locals in sites scattered across the island. A key part of this mission was that the peacekeepers were unarmed. This is in comparison to the other two where they were armed. In the initial phase of the mission, 120 of the 250 personnel were Australian, and in the second phase, 240 of the 300 personnel were Australian. I'm sure most of those numbers and acronyms have washed right over your head, but at least in a sense, hopefully you have a little bit of context for peacekeepers' stories. So I want to just move on now to the way in which the participants in this project ordered and talked about some of their memories. When I asked peacekeepers what that word or that title, peacekeeper, or to do peacekeeping meant to them, the answers were often ambivalent and confused. This, I think it's fair to say, very simply resolved from some of the more general complexity of defining peacekeeping. But I think it was also related to the ways in which peacekeepers were negotiating a place in the muddied landscape of memories of past and present conflicts. Sergeant Wally Morant, for instance, who served in Bougainville and Timor, spoke on this issue. And he said, "Yeah, see, I never really thought we were keeping the peace the whole time. I suppose the presence there is what that was designed to do, but Bougainville it was never a day when I was in a position where I had to stop anything, so I didn't make a difference in that regard. The presence of the force probably did, but yeah, peacekeeping, I never actually did anything physically." And I responded, "So in that sense, do you mean peacekeeping is sort of only when you stop violence? Is that what you mean when you say that?" He replied, "Well, that's my interpretation of peacekeeping. You see, I didn't think East Timor was peacekeeping. I don't actually know what I thought that was. Bougainville definitely, because we didn't have a weapon, and so to me that was there, well, you were there to keep the peace, but we weren't involved in any shooting. Whereas in East Timor, you might have had to." This is a typical kind of discussion that comes from this question I asked. And I think that there are a number of reasons that this is the kind of trend in their memory making. The first, as I said, is that they simply seem to be mirroring a lot of the complexity around defining peacekeeping. Peacekeeping has never been defined in the United Nations Charter, and over the last half century, under the hands of military folks and academics, peacekeeping has flowered into a bewildering set of descriptions and definitions. It's probably fair to say that the very nature of peacekeeping being complex and unstable probably makes it unsuitable for definition anyway. Another part of the reasons for these kinds of memories is that after the Cold War and prior to 9/11, peacekeeping had steadily become a regular part of just the wide variety of jobs that ADF personnel were asked to do. So there wasn't a sense in which it was an activity that needed peculiar definition or to be corralled off into a special place. But I think that these kinds of memories are telling us something a little more subtle. Peacekeeping has been, and it continues to be, a contested space. And I think peacekeepers are in the process of grappling with this. There has been a perception, basically since peacekeeping began, that peacekeeping is not like a real war. They're not really dangerous. They often happen without a so-called enemy, and sometimes even without weapons. They certainly were not proper wars, like the two world wars, or even the more contested Vietnam. This situation has been exacerbated by complex governmental classifications that are given to service, such as warlike or non-warlike. Now, ostensibly this is to manage Veterans Affairs benefits and salaries and so on, but this kind of language really plays into the way peacekeepers are remembering and valuing their service. I think we can see that this kind of issue continues to be of huge importance in the debates we've seen in the last few years about how to properly honour peacekeepers at the Australian War Memorial on the Roll of Honour. But I think if we can think a little more historically about these kinds of memories as well, I think we can hear in these stories that peacekeepers are negotiating with the nation and with the ADF's militarised Anzac past. Some peacekeepers were at extraordinary pains to correct my use of the term peacekeeping, to describe what they did, even despite their own ambivalence towards this idea. Sergeant Chris McLeod, for instance, responded in this discussion, "I should probably make a clarification here, Kim. I wasn't on peacekeeping, I was on peace enforcing." Other people were of the opinion that whatever designation their operation had been given, it did not properly convey what they had been through. There was an overwhelming anxiety in this group of participants to prove and to qualify and to clarify. Like some of the great war veterans in Alastair Thompson's study on the influence of the Anzac legend on memory making, many peacekeepers seem to be finding it hard to figure a place for themselves within that myth. But unlike Thompson's participants, these peacekeepers were not so much negotiating the way personal experiences did or did not fit within a legitimate war. Rather, their concern is how to make personal experience from a contested, ambiguous conflict fit within that Anzac legend. While other scholars of war and gender, and certainly international relations scholars of peacekeeping, have shown that similar anxieties seem to exist in other comparable countries and militaries, suggesting here that negotiating with the Anzac myth is not the sole explanation for these memories, I would still argue that narrative, that Anzac narrative, has significantly influenced peacekeepers' memory making. And I think out of the 3 different groups in the Oral History Project, this is profoundly so for ADF personnel. The ADF expends a lot of time and energy to keep alive a real sense of connection to soldiers and wars of the past, particularly the 2 world wars. And by all of the peacekeepers' accounts, it seems as though this provided a compelling, if not always easy to negotiate, scaffold to make sense of and attribute meaning to their peacekeeping service. Jeff Smith, for instance, who I interviewed but who also gave me his field diary from his service in Timor, opened his diary with, "This is something I have to do. This is my 1914, my 1939. Dylan Bond, a young veteran just in his 30s, explained in detail the active remembering and ritualising of tradition that happened when he was an infantryman in the ADF. He said, "Yeah, I think for me personally that was something that really appealed to me, serving my country. Being able to do some good and, yeah, if necessary, defend my country. And you do a lot. Well, you learn a lot about the history, even if you didn't know much before you joined. But once you're in, there's a huge amount of emphasis put on the tradition that's been carried down. There's certainly a lot of respect for the soldiers that have gone before, particularly in the First and Second World Wars, and we absolutely see our role as continuing that tradition." However, since I'm in a room with oral historians, we all know the process of remembering is as much about the present as it is about the past at which we're trying to get. And I want to suggest tentatively at this point, but it appears as if recent, and especially the current war in Afghanistan and more recent wars in the Middle East, on the one hand, are shaping up to just be yet more so-called proper wars to which peacekeeping cannot compare. For instance, Navy Warrant Officer John Perryman said, "I think generally Australians are proud of the peacekeepers, but having said that, I think that peacekeeping operations in light of recent work in Iraq, Afghanistan, the Persian Gulf, I think peacekeeping is seen as the second." This is a typical kind of opinion. But on the other hand, in perhaps a contradictory way, these more recent wars, while they might be hard to live up to, they seem to actually be helping peacekeepers to put a moral value on their service. Some peacekeepers expressed that they had no problems going to Bougainville, Solomons or Timor, that in fact they thought it was right to go. But in almost every case, these opinions were made in reference to Afghanistan and or Iraq. Army Captain Kania Elias, for instance, was much surer of her service in Solomon Islands than her work in Iraq. She said, "I think for me the biggest difference was the moral, well, like the difficulty. It's just much easier to justify our involvement in the souls. We're not there, we're not offensively engaged. We're just there peacekeeping." Caelan Lennon also expressed similar sentiments. He said, "I had the chance to go to Afghanistan 2 years ago, but I couldn't justify it. It's very different from peacekeeping." So just to wind up, the point of this paper today was to try to show some of the complex and perhaps contradictory ways in which Australian peacekeepers who've served in these specific places have actually looked beyond their personal experience of those places to understand their service on them. This process of remembering itself says much about what it has meant and continues to mean to be a peacekeeper from the Australian Defence Force. But in a broader sense, I think, well, I hope anyway, that this paper today has also illustrated that by listening to and attempting to understand the recollections of peacekeepers themselves on their own terms, that perhaps we can see new questions and new ways to push forward the history of Australia's peacekeeping. I think this kind of exploration offers the chance to broaden and to shift the boundaries of these stories and to tell them more fully. Thank you.